Vem är du?
Jag är döden.
Kommer du för att hämta mig?
Jag har redan länge gått vid din sida.
Det vet jag.
Är du beredd?
Min kropp är rädd. Inte jag själv.
Although you may have not seen this film or know the name of it, I can almost guarantee that you do find this scene to be totally recognizable. The story of a knight named Antonius Black has found himself under death's grasp in the mortality of men. An iconic story that is understood throughout many cultures that can be thanked for its expansion by one man, Ingmar Bergman. Ingmar Bergman was born July 14th, 1918 in Uppsala, Sweden, to a father who was a Lutheran minister. His father's title and religious household would later give him a great inspiration for the tones and subjects he brought up in his films. As a child, Bergman had many problems in schooling in Sweden. He was later shipped to a school in then Nazi Germany, where he stayed with a family who was largely in support of Hitler at the time. Later in Bergman's life, he attended Stockholm University, where he studied art and literature, where at some point was conceded that he was movie-obsessed by his peers. Bergman never completed his schooling at the university, but still found himself to be a wildly successful filmmaker. In his early career, Bergman had written many screenplays and quickly began making them into films. Over Bergman's long career, he is accredited to making over 60 different films and documentaries. In 1957, Bergman released two pieces that would change the film world forever. Released just 10 months apart, The Seventh Seal and Wild Strawberries hit the screens of Sweden, both of which won numerous awards across Sweden. The films have striking contrasts in the ways that Bergman attempts to recreate old memories from the past, yet they have wildly different approaches to those memories. In The Seventh Seal, we find a knight on a beach facing before him is death. The knight Antonius Black then challenges death to a game of chess and hopes to spare his life. In doing so, the knight confesses that he has not lived his life in the fullest yet, and therefore death should give him a second chance. In this act of defiance, we see that Bergman is challenging the notion of death and the strange mystical aspects that have been lingering over his head as a young boy in a religious household. Although death plays along with the game by following the knight with his game of chess, the knight is mistaken to think somehow he is taking advantage of death with his tricks. The knight enters a church where he confesses seemingly to a priest that his life has not been full of joy and therefore useless and not wisely spent. Little does the knight know that the priest is actually death himself, wrapped in a priest's clothing. This type of guilt that the knight is expressing is profound in the ways that guilt is systematically implemented through religion and the ways that Bergman himself rejected those ideas throughout his life and work. He explains this in his book, Images, My Life in Film. Quote, I believe a human being carries his or own holiness, which lies within the realm of the earth. There are no otherworldly explanations. So in the film lies a remnant of my honesty, childish piety, lying peacefully alongside a harsh and rational perception of reality. Bergman also talked the exploration of memories in this film, taking the knight from place to place, and at one point to a juggler in which the knight shares a bowl of wild strawberries with the wife of the juggler. The knight then has a memorable quote regarding the moment he has with the women. I'll carry this memory between my hands if it were a bowl filled to the brim with fresh milk. Bergman is challenging the ways in which we live our lifestyle, as if we are going to live a long, peaceful, and joyous planned life, never considering that death may be fast approaching as we know it. He is asking the audience in one way or another that if they only had a few days to live, would they be satisfied? We can see that again in the film he released right after The Seventh Seal. In this film, we find an old man who is invited to receive his doctorate jubilaris in Stockholm, a fairly distant ride from where the old man lives. Reluctantly, and by the persistence of his assistant, the old man finally breaks down and agrees to attend the ceremony. But along the journey into the city, the old man is accompanied by his pregnant daughter-in-law and many different visitors from the past. The old man in the beginning of the film is exhausting, grumpy, and unpleasant to be around. His daughter-in-law basically calls him an asshole at one point in their dialogue. But as the journey goes along, the old man's demeanor and attitude towards life would drastically change. They find themselves stopped in an old house where the old man had grown up. He sits in the garden and begins to daydream about his previous life and a previous crush he once had. The nostalgia that Bergman is after in this film reigns through the themes and ideas he explores in many of his other works. The old man begins to relive his previous life by simply sitting in the garden. He sees the ways he treated the girl he had a crush on and how unruly or ungrateful he was in his life. The man throughout the film is coming to realization in life and nostalgic speak as the film carries on. Quote, "If I have been worried or sad during the day, it often calms me to recall childhood memories." Although some critics have made remarks such as, quote, "What Mr. Bergman had that those two masters lacked was the power to entertain," which often meant a reluctance to challenge conventional film. And the writer for this article is not wrong. Bergman films are not entertaining. In many cases, they're flat out boring. But the intention of these films is not to be a part of the entertainment side of video, rather to explore the emotions and patience of the audience members. Bergman's films should not be taken at the hand of entertainment. Bergman's films should not be taken at the hand of entertainment. They should not be subject to whether or not they've given the audience times of joy and folly. Bergman, in many different films, had always carried the aspect of emotional, nostalgic, religious, and depth-filled nuances of life. We can also see Bergman's obsession with his mother in his films, such as the opening scene for Persona, where a child is stuck inside a room that represents a womb. The child is seen laid out on a table with one cloth and eventually bringing his hand to a glass where his mother's face lies. In the last known interview with Bergman, he was quoted as saying, "I was very much in love with my mother. She was very warm and a very cold woman. When she was warm, I tried to come close to her, but she could be cold and rejecting." This is a key element into the story of the film Persona, a story of a woman coming to terms with herself and an abortion she had just recently had. We can see much of Bergman's personal life in his films. The contributions that Bergman has made to the film industry are subtle. In many cases, we rarely hear Bergman as top-tier filmmaker, someone that gets recognition in the likes of Hitchcock or Kubrick. Yet undoubtedly Bergman changed the ways films have been told and shaped from his first release, The Seventh Seal, with its mystical tales about death and nostalgia. We see this imagery of death coming to get people in nearly all forms of media. The Simpsons have mentioned this reference, shows such as Family Guy, or any well-known cartoon or animation. As reported in Time magazine, the Colbert Report uses this imagery too. Quote, "The Colbert Report has an occasional segment called Cheating Death, which is introduced by the image of Stephen facing the hooded figure of Death over a chessboard. That's a reference to the 1957 film The Seventh Seal, a medieval morality play written and directed by Ingmar Bergman. Colbert, who switches chess pieces while Death is distracted, parodies the role of the knight, who puts his soul on the line to save a few lives during a season of plague. Instantly, when we as viewers see a man in a black coat appearing in a scene of a show, we know what's happening. We recognize the context. We have Ingmar Bergman to thank for that." Bergman's role in film history has mostly gone unnoticed, but without Bergman, we'd be watching film in a totally different light. Bergman has changed the ways in which storytellers and filmmakers create emotions, inspiring the likes of Tarkovsky and how a story can be told and painful to watch. The pacing of his films are a tough pill to swallow, but a necessary evil to the emotions of the piece. Bergman has inspired me to explore the subtleties of life and the nostalgic emotions of storytelling.